Hello Human Body System students, here is our lesson on the brain. I just wanted to warn you in advance that the little laser pointer function of my PowerPoint recording here is not working, so I'm not going to be able to point at stuff for you, but I'm going to try to describe which images I'm talking about as I go. Okay, so the brain is part of what we call the central nervous system. This is often just abbreviated as the CNS. The CNS is composed of the brain and the spinal cord. Any type of neural tissue that is within the brain or within the actual spinal cord, which is like this tail structure that peeks out of the bottom of the brain and travels all the way down your back. It's protected on the outside by the vertebra of your back. Anything that's part of the brain or spinal cord is part of the central nervous system. The brain communicates with the rest of the body through the peripheral nervous system, also called the PNS. This is just any other nervous tissue that's anywhere outside of the brain or the spinal cord. So any of the nerves that are rooted in the spine but extend out into the rest of the body through the limbs and anywhere else, those are part of the peripheral nervous system, PNS. Okay, now on to the brain. So the brain is divided up into chunks kind of based on what those chunks do. The first chunk is called the cerebrum, which is further divided into pieces, which we'll talk about in just a second here. But the cerebrum is also called the forebrain. This is the outer brain. So when you think of what you know a brain looks like, this is what you're thinking of. You're thinking of the cerebrum. It's divided into two hemispheres, the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, which are connected by the structure called the corpus callosum, which if you look at this picture in the bottom right, it's the kind of firm looking ridge down the center of the brain there. That is the corpus callosum. So the left brain and right brain, there's like kind of a saying where you can be considered to be left-brained or right-brained, and that's not completely false because there are different regions on the different hemispheres of the brain that control different things. So like for example, the left brain is more involved with things like logic and mathematical thinking, and the right brain is more involved with things like creativity and emotions. So now the cerebrum is divided up into lobes that have pretty specific functions. First we have the frontal lobe of the cerebrum. This is like what makes you who you are. Your personality is controlled by this. Any kind of positive emotions that you have, like happiness, are go on in the frontal lobe. Your just awareness of being alive and existing is in the frontal lobe. Any rational thought, any kind of decision making that you do is part of the frontal lobe. There's also a feature called the primary motor cortex. So if you look at this diagram of the brain in the top right over here, you can see the orange illuminated portion of the frontal lobe, and then just behind that, just posterior to that, there's kind of a vertical ridge that's there, and that's called the primary motor cortex, and that is the part of your brain that coordinates all of your motor movements and kind of makes the decisions about how your body is going to move. There is also a region called Broca's area, which if you look in the bottom right over here, it's the red highlighted portion. It's at the inferior portion of the frontal lobe, and this is a spot of your brain that's involved in speech production. And so this is a place where if you were to have something like a stroke in your brain, in your Broca's area, you could possibly still understand things that people are saying, but you wouldn't be able to say things back to them because your Broca's area, where your speech production is limited. There's also a structure called an olfactory bulb, which is just kind of a little thing that's it's like a little nub kind of sticking down from the frontal lobe at the bottom posterior to the eyes, and that has to do with reception of smell. And then there's also the gustatory reflex, or the gustatory cortex, which is involved with your sensation of taste. So those are all parts of the frontal lobe of the cerebrum. The parietal lobe of the cerebrum is just posterior to the frontal lobe. The main function of the parietal lobe is to deal with any kind of sensory input from the body, and so the parietal lobe receives and interprets sensory input from the body, and then it kind of communicates with the frontal lobe so that your body can make a decision about how to move based on whatever the sensory input is from your environment. So the frontal lobe had the primary motor cortex, and then just posterior to the primary motor cortex, so if we're looking at this diagram here, the orange illuminated portion is the parietal lobe, and then just anterior to that, just in front of that, you can see another kind of vertical ridge there. That is the primary sensory cortex. So the primary sensory cortex of your brain detects the senses and then communicates to the primary motor cortex of the frontal lobe about what that sensory input means and what the motor cortex can decide to do about it. Next we have the temporal lobe of the cerebrum, so again highlighted in orange in the picture in the upper right here. The main function of the temporal lobe is auditory processing. So if you think about it, it's kind of like located just deeper than where your ear is on your head. So you can think about that connection to remember that the temporal lobe is auditory processing. There is a piece of the temporal lobe that's kind of like the partner to the Broca's area that's in the frontal lobe. If you look in the bottom right over here, the red highlighted piece is called Wernicke's area, and Wernicke's area is the part of your brain that interprets spoken language. So again, if you were to have something like a stroke in your Wernicke's area, you could possibly still talk and communicate what you were thinking to other people, but then when they speak, it just sounds like gibberish because your Wernicke's area is compromised by that stroke. And then the last lobe of the cerebrum is called the occipital lobe, which is nice because it's located right in that occipital region that we learned about previously when we did anatomical terms. So the occipital lobe's main function in the brain is for visual processing. You can see in the picture in the bottom right here that the optic nerve that runs from the back of the eyeball pretty much connects directly into that occipital lobe in the back of the brain. So the main function of the occipital lobe is just interpreting the things that you see. So that's everything in the cerebrum, and now moving on to what's called the midbrain. So the midbrain is more base functions. This is the upper portion of the brainstem, kind of where the brainstem connects into the brain. It's like it plugs into the brain there. The midbrain does stuff like it helps with coordinating different senses. So it helps with a little bit of eye movement. So like if you were to hear something, the midbrain will help you realize which direction that's coming from, and then you can look towards it. So pretty much the midbrain is just functioning to kind of help you coordinate the different senses so that your brain knows what to do about that sensory input. And then we have what's called the hindbrain. So the hindbrain is composed of three main regions. First is the pons. The pons is the area that is connecting the cerebrum, so everything that we just talked about in the first few slides, all those different divisions of the cerebrum that do most of your brain stuff, and the cerebellum. So the cerebellum, if you look at the bottom of my list here, the cerebellum is this green thing in the back of the brain, and it pretty much coordinates all of your balance and like so that you can move all of your different muscles together. So your primary motor cortex of your frontal lobe makes all the decisions, and then the cerebellum helps to coordinate all of the different muscle movements that are involved in the different motions of the human body. And so then the last part of the hindbrain is called the medulla oblongata. A lot of times this is referred to as like your lizard brain because it makes your body do all of the base functions of you as an animal. So it helps you coordinate your breathing, digestion, sneezing, swallowing, basically any kind of reflex that you might have, like some function that your body needs to do that you don't need to actively be thinking about. That is all controlled by the medulla oblongata. And now finally, we're on to the last portion here of the brain. This is the inner brain, sometimes also called the limbic system. It's made up of four main regions. First is the amygdala. So the amygdala is that little nub that's labeled kind of towards the bottom of the brain in the picture to the right there. The amygdala controls any kind of emotions that are, maybe you could think of these more like animal emotions. So as opposed to things like happiness, which is something that we feel in our frontal lobe, your amygdala controls negative emotions like fear and anger, any kind of emotion that would maybe be better for helping to keep you alive in our evolutionary past. The olfactory bulb is also sometimes considered part of the limbic system just because of where it's located in the brain. It's back there kind of inside of the brain, so it's kind of considered both part of the frontal lobe and the limbic system. And then there's also the hippocampus. So the hippocampus functions to convert your short-term memories that you gained during the day into long-term memories while you sleep at night. So this is why it's so important to sleep. It helps your memory. This is why if you spend the night before a test cramming but you don't get enough sleep, a lot of that time you spent cramming is wasted because your hippocampus didn't have a chance to convert those short-term crammed memories into long-term memories inside of your brain that you can access later. And then finally we have the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is also an important member of the endocrine system because it secretes some hormones, but we'll get into that a lot later. The hypothalamus is basically helping your body maintain its homeostasis. So it helps to regulate your blood pressure, your hunger and thirst hormones, and then also your heartbeat. So between the hypothalamus and the medulla oblongata, that's pretty much what you've got keeping you alive and keeping you just existing as a person.